A food critic from the Miami Herald knocked on my door asking to interview me about my award-winning pasta recipe that made my restaurant chain so successful. I told him I'd never owned a restaurant or won any awards. He showed me Lisa's website, featuring my photo and claiming I was the celebrated chef behind 5 locations across Florida. Before we start, don't forget to like this video, comment where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. Have you experienced something like this? Please let me know in the comments. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 66 years old, and I live in Orlando, Florida. And this is the story of how I discovered my daughter was running a $1 million investment scam using my name and photos to convince people I was a successful restaurant owner. It was a humid Thursday morning in September when I heard the doorbell ring at my modest apartment on Colonial Drive. I wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare since I'd been living quietly on my Social Security and small pension from the hotel where I'd worked in housekeeping for 32 years. Through the peephole, I could see a well-dressed man in his 40s holding a notepad and what looked like a professional camera. "Mrs. Martinez?" he said when I opened the door. "I'm David Chen from the Miami Herald food section. I was hoping to interview you about your incredible success story and get the secret behind your famous 3-cheese lasagna recipe that's made your restaurant empire so popular across Central Florida." I stared at him, completely confused by every word he just said. Restaurant empire? Famous lasagna recipe? I'd never owned a restaurant in my life, barely knew how to cook beyond basic meals, and certainly had never been successful enough to warrant attention from newspaper food critics. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, but David pulled out his phone and showed me a professional website with my photograph prominently displayed at the top. The site was called Mama Rosa's Restaurant Group and featured my smiling face next to text describing me as Rebecca Martinez, award-winning chef and founder of Central Florida's most beloved Italian restaurant chain. According to the website, I was the celebrated creator of 5 successful restaurants across Orlando, Tampa, and Jacksonville, serving authentic Italian cuisine based on my grandmother's recipes. There were photos of elegant dining rooms, glowing customer reviews, and even a fabricated story about how I'd started with a single food truck and built a multi-million-dollar restaurant empire through hard work and traditional cooking methods. "This isn't me," I told David, though obviously the photos were real pictures of me, probably taken from my social media accounts that Lisa had access to. "I've never owned a restaurant or cooked professionally. I don't even know how to make lasagna from scratch." David looked confused and slightly embarrassed. "But your daughter Lisa contacted our office 3 weeks ago. She submitted your story for our upcoming feature on successful women entrepreneurs in the food industry. She provided all this information about your restaurants, your awards, even your plans for expanding into Georgia next year." My heart sank as I realized what was happening. Lisa, my 38-year-old daughter who'd been struggling financially since her divorce, had been using my name and identity to create an elaborate fiction about restaurant success that didn't exist. But if she was contacting food critics and building professional websites, this wasn't just a harmless lie. This was something much more serious and potentially criminal. After David Chen left with apologies and promises to verify his information before publishing anything, I spent the next hour exploring the fake website Lisa had created using my identity. What I discovered made me realize this wasn't just a fantasy or harmless exaggeration. This was a sophisticated fraud scheme designed to steal money from people who believed they were investing in my successful restaurant business. The website was professionally designed with high-quality photos of restaurant interiors that Lisa must have found online or taken at real establishments. My photo appeared throughout the site, sometimes with fake quotes about my passion for authentic Italian cuisine and my commitment to family recipes passed down through generations. There were even fabricated customer testimonials praising my incredible 3-cheese lasagna and warm family atmosphere that made my restaurant special. But the most disturbing section was labeled Investment Opportunities, which invited potential investors to become partners in expanding my restaurant empire. The page claimed I was seeking $2.5 million in funding to open 10 new locations over the next 2 years, promising investors 40% annual returns based on my proven track record of success and growing market demand for authentic Italian dining experiences. There was a contact form for interested investors, along with Lisa's phone number and email address listed as my business manager and daughter. The page included financial projections showing how each new restaurant would generate $1.2 million in annual revenue making partnership investments virtually risk-free for people who wanted to join my expanding food empire. I called Lisa immediately, my hands shaking, as I dialed her number while staring at the fake website that had turned me into a fictional restaurant mogul, without my knowledge or consent. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and cheerful like nothing unusual was happening. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing today?" "Lisa, I need you to come over right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A food critic just left my apartment, asking about my restaurant chain and my award-winning pasta recipes. Do you want to explain to me what's going on?" There was a long pause before Lisa responded, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted from cheerful to cautious. "Mom, I can explain everything. It's not what you think. I was just trying to help you build a better future. By lying about me owning restaurants. By using my photo on a website claiming I'm a successful chef. Lisa, this isn't helping me. This is identity theft and fraud. Can we talk about this in person?" Lisa asked. "I'll come over right now and explain the whole situation. You're going to understand once I tell you what I've been working on." But I was already understanding more than I wanted to. The professional website, the investor solicitation, the detailed financial projections. Lisa hadn't just told a few harmless lies about my cooking abilities. She'd created an elaborate business fraud using my identity, and she was actively seeking money from people who believed they were investing in my non-existent restaurant empire. Scene 3. The confession. Lisa arrived at my apartment 30 minutes later, carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive and professional, like something a real business consultant might use when meeting with potential investors. She was dressed in a sharp business suit I'd never seen before, and her whole demeanor suggested she'd been playing the role of successful entrepreneur for longer than just the website creation. "Mom, before you get upset, let me show you what I've been building for us," she said, opening the portfolio to reveal printed financial projections, restaurant floor plans, and what appeared to be legitimate business documentation. "I've been working for 8 months to create investment opportunities that will make both of us wealthy beyond anything we've ever imagined." I looked through the papers, each one more elaborate than the last, all based on the fundamental lie that I owned and operated successful restaurants. There were detailed budgets for restaurant construction, staffing plans for locations that didn't exist, even architectural drawings for kitchen layouts and dining room configurations. "Lisa, none of this is real," I said, setting the papers aside. "I don't own any restaurants. I've never cooked professionally. You've built this entire fantasy around a business that doesn't exist." "But it could exist," Lisa said, her voice taking on the kind of passionate intensity that people use when they're trying to convince themselves, as much as their audience. "Mom, I've already raised $480,000 from investors who believe in your restaurant concept. With that money, we could actually open our first location and make everything legitimate." The casual way she mentioned raising nearly $500,000 from people she'd defrauded using my identity made me feel sick. "You took money from people based on lies about me. That's not building a business, Lisa. That's theft." "It's not theft if we use the money to create what we promised," Lisa argued. "I found a perfect location in Altamonte Springs, signed a lease, even hired a contractor to begin renovations. The investors think they're funding expansion of your existing empire, but we'll make it real by opening our first actual restaurant." I stared at my daughter, trying to understand how the child I'd raised had become someone who could rationalize major fraud as entrepreneurial vision. "Where is the $480,000 right now?" Lisa hesitated before answering. "Some of it went to business development costs, the website, marketing materials, legal consultations. The rest is in a business account waiting for the restaurant construction to begin." "How much is left?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "About $200,000. Lisa admitted. "But Mom, that's enough to get started. Once we open the first restaurant and start generating revenue, we can pay back the investors with interest and expand from there." The fact that she'd already spent more than half of the stolen money on business development costs that were probably personal expenses told me everything I needed to know about Lisa's actual business skills and the likelihood that any restaurant she opened would succeed. 2 days after Lisa's confession, I received a phone call that made me realize the full scope of the damage my daughter had done using my identity. The caller was Margaret Williams, a retired teacher from Jacksonville who had invested $45,000 of her pension money in what she believed was my restaurant expansion project. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm calling because I'm concerned about the timeline for opening the new Jacksonville location," Margaret said. Lisa told me 3 months ago that construction would begin by September, but when I drive by the address she gave me, it's just an empty lot with no signs of development. My heart broke listening to this woman who had trusted Lisa's lies about my business success and invested her retirement savings in restaurants that would never exist. Margaret, I need to tell you something very difficult. I don't own any restaurants, and I never authorized my daughter to seek investments using my name. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought the call had been dropped. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was shaking. Are you saying this is all fake? That there are no restaurants? I'm saying my daughter has been committing fraud using my identity, and I'm as much a victim as you are, I told her, trying to balance honesty with compassion for someone who was learning she'd been swindled. I'm working with lawyers and law enforcement to address this situation and hopefully recover your money. Margaret started crying, and through her tears, she told me about 4 other investors from her retirement community, who had also given money to Lisa based on the fake restaurant empire. The total from her community alone was over $200,000. All from elderly people who had believed they were making safe investments in my proven food business. We thought it was perfect, Margaret said. A successful woman entrepreneur with a track record of profitable restaurants, seeking expansion capital with guaranteed returns. Lisa showed us photos of your existing locations, customer reviews, even financial statements showing consistent profits. Everything Margaret described confirmed that Lisa's fraud was far more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. She hadn't just created a website and taken some money, she'd developed a complete false business identity for me, complete with fake financial records and fabricated proof of success that convinced elderly investors to trust her with their life savings. After hanging up with Margaret, I called the Orlando Police Department and reported Lisa for identity theft, investment fraud, and elder abuse. The detective who took my report, Sarah Rodriguez, told me that investment scams targeting elderly victims often involved family members who used their access to personal information to create convincing fraudulent opportunities. Your daughter's scheme is particularly sophisticated, Detective Rodriguez explained. Using a family member's identity as the successful business owner gives the fraud credibility that outside criminals can't achieve. The victims trust the family connection and assume the investments are legitimate. Detective Rodriguez arranged for me to work with the FBI's white-collar crime unit. Since Lisa's scheme crossed state lines and involved multiple elderly victims, the investigation would focus on recovering as much of the stolen money as possible, while building a criminal case against Lisa for wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. Agent Michael Torres from the FBI's Orlando office arrived at my apartment the next morning with a briefcase full of documents and a laptop computer that he used to show me the full extent of Lisa's criminal enterprise. What I learned during our 3-hour meeting made me realize my daughter hadn't just committed fraud, she'd built an entire fake business empire using my identity as the foundation. Your daughter has been operating this scheme for 14 months, Agent Torres explained, showing me bank records that tracked money flowing in and out of accounts opened in my name without my knowledge. She's collected over $800,000 from 43 different investors across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, all of whom believe they're partnering with your successful restaurant chain. The numbers were staggering and made me feel sick, thinking about how many elderly people had trusted Lisa's lies about my business success. Each investor had been promised 40% annual returns on their money, with guaranteed buyback options if they ever wanted to withdraw their investments. How did she convince so many people? I asked, though I was dreading the answer. Agent Torres opened his laptop and showed me a comprehensive marketing campaign Lisa had created around my fictional restaurant empire. There were social media accounts with thousands of followers, professional food photography supposedly from my kitchens, even fake news articles about my success that appeared to be from legitimate publications. She's created an entire alternate reality where you're a celebrated chef and successful businesswoman, Agent Torres said. The website, the social media presence, the fake press coverage, it's sophisticated enough to fool people who do their research before investing. Lisa had also created fake customer reviews, fabricated awards from non-existent culinary organizations, and even staged photos of me supposedly working in restaurant kitchens that were actually just high-end kitchens she'd found in vacation rental properties. The most concerning part is that she's been using your identity to open business bank accounts, apply for loans, and even establish credit lines that you'll be responsible for if we can't prove fraud, Agent Torres warned. Your daughter hasn't just stolen money from investors, She's potentially destroyed your credit rating and financial security. The investigation revealed that Lisa had spent the stolen money on personal expenses rather than legitimate business development. She'd bought a new car, moved into an expensive apartment, purchased designer clothes and jewelry, and taken luxury vacations, all while telling investors their money was funding restaurant construction and equipment purchases. "Where is she living now?" I asked, because I realized I hadn't actually known Lisa's current address or even her real financial situation for several months. Agent Torres consulted his notes. A luxury apartment in Winter Park that costs $4,200 per month. She's been telling people she manages your restaurant empire and earns a six-figure salary, which explains how she can afford the lifestyle. The fact that Lisa was living in luxury while her victims lost their retirement savings made me realize that my daughter had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of stealing from elderly people while maintaining the facade of a successful business professional. The FBI arrested Lisa at her Winter Park apartment on a Tuesday morning, while she was preparing for a meeting with potential new investors who had responded to her online marketing about my restaurant expansion opportunities. Agent Torres called me after the arrest to explain what they'd found during their search of her apartment. "Your daughter was in the middle of planning to raise another $1.2 million from investors," he told me. "She had detailed presentations ready for meetings scheduled throughout the week, all based on expanding your fictional restaurant empire into new markets." The search had revealed a sophisticated operation with multiple computers, professional marketing materials, and detailed files on each investor she'd defrauded. Lisa had been tracking her victims' financial situations, targeting elderly people with substantial savings who could afford large investments but might be less technologically savvy about verifying business information online. She kept detailed records of every investor's personal information, including their medical histories and family situations. Agent Torres explained, she was specifically targeting people who had recently lost spouses or were dealing with health issues that made them vulnerable to investment scams, promising financial security. Lisa was charged with wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and elder abuse under federal statutes that carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison. The state of Florida also filed charges related to the local victims, and prosecutors from 3 states were coordinating to ensure she faced consequences in every jurisdiction where she'd committed crimes. The arraignment took place the following week, and I sat in the courtroom watching my daughter enter a plea of not guilty, while her court-appointed attorney argued that she had genuinely intended to use the investor money to create legitimate restaurants. The judge wasn't sympathetic to this argument, especially when prosecutors presented evidence showing Lisa had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on personal expenses while her elderly victims waited for returns on their investments. The defendant created an elaborate fraud scheme, using her mother's identity to steal money from vulnerable elderly victims. Prosecutor Janet Morrison said during the bail hearing, she targeted retirees who trusted her because of the family connection and her mother's supposed business success. This represents a particularly heinous form of elder abuse that deserves the maximum penalties available under federal law. Lisa was denied bail and remained in federal detention while awaiting trial. Her attorney tried to argue that she was a first-time offender who had made poor decisions under financial pressure, but the evidence showed systematic planning and deliberate targeting of vulnerable victims over more than a year. The civil lawsuits began within days of the arrest, as 43 different victims sought to recover their stolen investments through asset forfeiture and restitution claims. Most of Lisa's luxury possessions were seized by federal marshals and would be sold to provide partial compensation to her victims, though the total recovery would likely be only a fraction of what had been stolen. 6 months after Lisa's arrest, I sat in the federal courthouse in Orlando listening to 12 elderly victims give impact statements before her sentencing. Each story was more heartbreaking than the last, describing how Lisa's fraud had destroyed retirement plans, forced people to return to work in their 70s, and created financial stress that affected their health and family relationships. Margaret Williams, the retired teacher from Jacksonville who had first contacted me about the delayed restaurant opening, told the court how losing $45,000 of her pension had forced her to sell her house and move in with her adult children. "I trusted Lisa because she said her mother was a successful businesswoman," Margaret testified. "I thought I was making a safe investment that would help secure my retirement. Instead, I lost everything I'd saved over 30 years of teaching." Robert Chen, a 74-year-old veteran from Tampa, explained how he'd invested $67,000 after Lisa convinced him that my restaurant business was expanding rapidly and needed partners who shared my vision for authentic Italian cuisine. I served my country for 26 years, and I never thought an American would steal my retirement money using lies about her own mother, he said. The most devastating testimony came from Helen Morrison, an 80-year-old widow from Gainesville, who had invested $89,000 after Lisa told her that my restaurant empire was looking for investors who understood the value of traditional family recipes. My husband died 2 years ago, and I was lonely and looking for ways to stay connected to other people, Helen told the court. Lisa made me feel like I was part of something important, like I was helping a successful woman expand her business. Instead, she stole my husband's life insurance money and left me with nothing. Each victim's story revealed how Lisa had tailored her fraud to their specific vulnerabilities, using my supposed success as a woman entrepreneur to convince other women that investing in my restaurant empire was both financially sound and personally meaningful. She'd created a sense of community and shared purpose around the fake business, making her victims feel like partners in my success rather than marks in a confidence scheme. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who specialized in white-collar crime, listened to every victim's statement without interruption. When the testimonies were finished, she addressed Lisa directly. Ms. Martinez, you systematically targeted elderly victims who trusted you because of your claimed family relationship with a successful businesswoman. You stole their retirement savings, destroyed their financial security, and betrayed the trust that makes communities possible. Lisa was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years, along with restitution requirements that would likely follow her for the rest of her life. The judge also ordered her to participate in victim impact programs and provide detailed financial disclosure to help investigators recover additional assets that might benefit her victims. As Lisa was led away in handcuffs, she turned to look at me with an expression that seemed to combine regret, anger, and disbelief that her elaborate scheme had resulted in such severe consequences. I felt nothing but sadness watching my daughter become a convicted felon, but I also knew that justice required her to face the full consequences of the pain she'd caused to so many trusting elderly people. 2 years after Lisa's conviction, I was volunteering with the AARP Fraud Prevention Program, speaking to senior groups across Central Florida about investment scams and the warning signs that indicate when family members might be using your identity for criminal purposes. My experience had taught me that Lisa's scheme, while sophisticated, followed patterns that elderly people could learn to recognize and avoid. The recovery process for Lisa's victims had been slow and incomplete, with most receiving only about 30 cents on the dollar from asset forfeiture and restitution payments. Several victims had filed successful lawsuits against the financial institutions that had allowed Lisa to open accounts and transfer money without proper verification of my identity, leading to improved security procedures for elderly account holders. My own financial situation had been complicated by Lisa's use of my identity to establish credit lines in business accounts that took months to resolve through the legal system. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit helped me work with credit reporting agencies and banks to clean up the damage Lisa had done to my credit rating and ensure that I wasn't held responsible for debts she'd incurred using my name. But perhaps the most important outcome was personal rather than financial. I discovered that I was stronger and more capable than I'd ever imagined, able to navigate complex legal proceedings and help other elderly people understand how to protect themselves from similar schemes. The experience had taught me to be suspicious of opportunities that seemed too good to be true, even when they came from family members. The media attention around Lisa's case had also led to policy changes in how investment opportunities are regulated and marketed to elderly people. Several states had implemented new requirements for disclosure and cooling-off periods when investment solicitations targeted seniors, making it harder for scammers to pressure vulnerable people into quick decisions. I still lived in the same modest apartment on Colonial Drive, but now I understood that my simple life was a form of success that couldn't be stolen or destroyed by people who saw me as a resource to be exploited. Lisa had tried to turn me into a fictional successful businesswoman to serve her criminal purposes, but I'd learned that my real success was measured by integrity, resilience, and the ability to help others avoid the pain she'd caused. Every week I received calls from elderly people across the country who had heard about my case and wanted advice about suspicious investment opportunities, or family members who seemed to be using their identities inappropriately. Each conversation reminded me that Lisa's betrayal, while devastating, had given me a purpose and a way to prevent other families from experiencing the same destruction. The restaurant empire that Lisa had created using my identity would never exist, But the network of people I'd connected with through the fraud prevention program was real, valuable, and growing stronger every day. Sometimes, the most important victories come from surviving betrayal and using that experience to protect others from similar harm.